Joanna, Valerie, Carla, welcome. Paul, hey. Oh, my namesake, Anna. Hola. Excellent. And so also, it seems like you've enabled the closed captioning. That would be really helpful too if you feel able to provide that as well. I know folks sometimes are both need that for accessibility and also it's helpful to them throughout the presentation. Patrick, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm so grateful to be here with you all today. So I want to I'm not sure if you were planning on a brief introduction or if you'd like for me to introduce myself.
Well, we're thrilled that you're here. Thank you, Dr. Nelson, for coming and speaking with our recipients. And I think we should dive right in. I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'll just hand it right over to you.
Oh, I feel really honored. And so just welcome into the space, everyone. I'm Anna Nelson, and I am here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So you may hear windy things outside. You may hear dogs barking. So I apologize in advance for our little special effects that are happening around us. But I'm just truly appreciative of this opportunity to join you all. It sounds like at the end of your training day. And quickly, a little bit about myself. I am a social work educator. I identify as mixed Latina. My mother was Latina and my father is Anglo. And I bring this actually is a tremendous topic for me. This is something about which I feel really passionately. And so I bring about 26 years experience out in community, serving Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, systems impacted families and young people. And my work really centers around anti-racism and the development of a new theory called critical trauma theory, which I'll tell you a little bit about today. It's a little bit about me. So normally I would in community, I would really open it up if you feel comfortable to add who you are and where you're from in chat. I would love to see where folks are zooming in from. And also if you have any particular questions that you would like me to answer throughout our conversation today. In addition to that, it is only an hour, and this topic literally we could talk about. We could literally chop this up for days and days. So please know that I'm cramming a whole lot of information into a short period of time, with the hope that I'll get to come back to you all at some point, or that you reach out to me if you have any curiosity. So before I get too much into the conversation, I want to just offer this land and labor acknowledgement, honoring the members of the 23 tribes and pueblos here in New Mexico as traditional stewards of these lands. I also want to recognize the impact of slavery and colonization on African, Asian, Indigenous, and Mexican peoples whose forced labor created this specific space in which we hold this dialogue today. The violent impact of its slavery, colonization, and genocide is not solely historical, but is present in today's environment. So this is just one small step, one small commitment I have toward racial truth-telling and reconciliation. I also would like to share that I am not by no means an expert on decolonization. So what I do bring to you is, I'm here as a co-learner with you all in a space for a safe dialogue to talk about some really deep topics that we can integrate into our work in serving individuals and families and communities who've been impacted by substance use. And so with that, it's a blessing that I'm able to join you today. So today happens to be my mother's 77th birthday. So I'd like to dedicate this presentation to my mother who passed from an overdose. So she would be turning 77 today. So I wanted to kind of bring her in this space as well as we talk about these topics. So I'm not going to get too researchy or too, I hope, too nerdy with you all about the stuff that we talk about today. So I'm just bringing some of my lived experiences and expertise from the work that I've done in community, my own lived experiences, as well as findings from 2 studies that I conducted here, specifically in New Mexico. So what I am bringing to you today is advised by young people and young adults who participated in these studies, and also social work students as a whole. So what I hope from this conversation is really to understand some key principles around decolonization and what that means for our behavioral health practices. Also to make, cultural humility is getting much more screenplay lately than it has been. It's been around since the 90s. And so I know that this is really familiar for folks. I hope to give you a few more tools in how we actually bring cultural humility to life and how that then relates to decolonization. I also wanted to share a little bit about the theory I was grateful for the opportunity to create, which is called critical trauma theory. So I'm going to introduce this all to you as maybe a tool or a framework to help move through ideas, big ideas like decolonization, like anti-racism, like abolitionism, what that looks like for our behavioral health work. And then finally, identifying cultural capital as sources for healing for Black, Indigenous, and people in communities of color. So really lots to talk about in a short period of time. Having said that, I do not consider it rude at all if you want to jump in and be like, hey, Anna, I have a question. And also I've asked our co-host here today to kind of monitor the chat and to let me know if things pop up or questions come up. So this way I can answer them and make this really meaningful for you. So one piece that, utilizing chat again, one piece that I use in every space where I go, because we tend to get deep pretty quick in the things that we talk about, to create that safety, that emotional safety, to be able to be in community and talking about these tough topics. I use this tool called community agreements. And this is something that I use literally in groups with young people, in my classrooms, in all different kind of spaces. So it's an idea of creating ground rules for this space. And so what I'm inviting you all to do is use chat again to go ahead and just in a few words, just let me know as your dialogue facilitator and co-learner, as well as your peers in this conversation today, what you need from me and everyone to feel completely safe and 100% all in to learn about this. So I'll just give you a second or two to go ahead and reply in chat. And Tanya, it was my honor. Thank you all. Wonderful. I see folks from Albuquerque being windified. Yes, Eric, I feel you. Awesome. Taos. Oh, wow. Thank you so much for being here. Santa Fe. Clovis. Excellent representation from the state. All right, so let me see what folks are saying. Actively listen. So Anna, you're saying it's important to listen. Listen and respect different perspectives. I agree. And if you ever do this out in community, respect is something that comes up a lot. So I always ask these questions like, what does respect feel like to you? How do you know you're being paid respect? How do you know you're giving respect? So if you ever choose to use this out in community, honoring the BIPOC experience. Yes, sir. They are not making things up. Yes, sir. 100%. Excellent. Well, feel free to put your needs, assume positive intent. Yes. And actually, we're going to talk about intentions and impact today. So Gray, thank you so much. That's perfect. Beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to cruise. I'm going to keep cruising until you all put questions in chat or let me know you're curious about something, okay? So So, the why behind this conversation, why are we here, in this space talking specifically about this? So what we know is that mental health practices are fundamentally situated within systems of power and colonial hegemony or dominance, right? That's a big word and nobody ever uses it. So it's colonial dominance, right? It's also about mental health experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people in communities of color are characterized by disconnections from ancestral culture and the land due to colonization. It also causes alienation from our culturally and spiritually grounded mental health practices. It also perpetuates racial trauma potentially, and I'll say potentially in a second, I'll explain that. Intersectional oppression and systemic inequities. And so, that's really our why here. So our professions, our collective behavioral health professions remain colonized through the adoption of these westernized concepts and practices, specifically around the medical model, diagnosing and what that looks like, as well as pathologizing and stigmatizing people. And finally, that these approaches do not look holistically at people, but instead at mind, body, and spirit as different things, right? So part of the decolonization process is creating space where all of those centering pieces of our identities are honored and respected. So I say, so I'm going to go ahead, it's complicated, right? These terminologies, this is a little bit complicated. And I'm going to start here by saying, so, when I was offered this opportunity to join you all, I felt really honored. And in the beginning, I mentioned, I do not feel expert in decolonization. I feel I have a lot of experience around anti-racist behavioral health and community practices. I say I do not feel expert because I believe that that Black, Indigenous, and communities and people of color are leaders in this work and are themselves experts, right? And to me, a fully decolonized behavioral health system is one that is completely designed for and by Black, Indigenous, and people in communities of color. So currently what we have is not designed for or by Black, Indigenous, and people in communities of color. So I really want to make sure I highlight that. And I also, this is kind of my little, thing. Sometimes I feel buzzwords come up, right? And the true intent behind those words are not necessarily honored. And so I want to do as much as I can to honor the true meaning of decolonization while noting that there are people much more expert than myself in this work. What I will do today is talk about the ways that abolitionism, anti-racism, and decolonization share some key tenets and how decolonization is unique, right? What I hope I'm kind of introducing into our consciousness is the importance of not colonizing and co-opting the term decolonization, if that makes sense. It's kind of like the idea behind imposter syndrome, right? There's some clear data on how that impacts BIPOC peoples, right? And yet it has been co-opted. And so each of these terms we want to claim for the community and honor those terms. So I see a quick question here. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that with the closed captioning. So it's complicated. And so I'm just gonna keep going and share a little bit. And again, that's only my perspective, right? So, all the literature out there is like, there's no one kind of term, right, that really fits for one kind of core definition that fits for decolonization, right? We have some key concepts that I'll share with you. But I thought I'd just break down this idea first of what is colonization, and that seems super simple, but it's also super complicated. So colonization, in 2003, and in 2003, this is pretty dated information, but I thought it was important to acknowledge that between 300 and 500 million indigenous peoples exist globally, right? So colonization has had a global impact. Globalization has had an impact in reinforcing colonization. And so why I wanted to raise the sheer volume of Indigenous peoples globally is because it's important to understand that among people who identify as Indigenous, these are folks who identify as the original descendants or inhabitants of a space, a community, traditional lands. And each community has their own distinct social, political, cultural identities embodied in the languages, traditions, political and legal institutions. So that gives us an idea of what's been taken when colonization occurs, right? What's been taken away, and what's been subjugated. So colonization is considered any act of forcibly establishing control over and subjugating Indigenous populations through appropriation of land, resources, and culture for the purposes of dominance and control. And this happens through violence, it happens through enslavement, and it happens through genocide. The status of the colonizer is then protected through systems of control that are embedded in social institutions, behavioral health being one of them, education, right? So I teach, right now, I teach social work. I sit in an institution that benefited from enslavement, from colonization. So I acknowledge that. So contemporary systems of behavioral health, we're in that space as well. Keep checking chat. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. So moving forward, the multiple definitions of, so I mentioned multiple definitions of decolonization exist. So I'm going to hit the high points, right? It is about a radical paradigm shift. It means that we have to think about things differently. And we have to behave and move through our work differently. So it includes transformative action and a commitment to liberation. So much of what we know moves the metric and really honors Black, Indigenous, and people in communities of color is about liberation. At its root, it's about liberation. And that means a process of repairing, restoring, and healing through relationship. Indigenous experts also, there are volumes of amazing work that Indigenous scholars and Indigenous perspectives out there about the process of decolonization. And at the end, I give you some resources in case you're curious and you want to learn more about this. So Indigenous experts see decolonization both as an event and as a process. Okay, so the event is that radical acknowledgement and that critical analysis and critical, consciousness that we have ourselves been impacted by colonization. So we're coming from spaces that are not true to our Indigenous identities, right? And what that means from our traditions and our cultures. So it's also a process. It means engaging in activities of creating, restoring, and birthing. And I really love that metaphor, right? It means creating and consciously using various strategies to liberate ourselves. All this work starts within, right? All of this work happens first with us. And then to restore cultural practices, traditional ways of thinking, belief, and healing practices, right? So finally, decolonization requires ongoing critical reflectivity and action to support Indigenous sovereignty, land repatriation, abolition of enslavement or abolishment of enslavement, systematic dismantling of dominant imperial systems and institutions. So when I said that there are some things that are related to abolitionism, right? This idea of removing ourselves from the carceral state, right? So much of the work that we do in behavioral health is directly linked to juvenile justice in my world, or adult corrections. It's linked to child protective services. It's linked to these carceral systems, and we're working to transform that. But what we've got right now is some of that is where we receive our funding from, right? So finding ways to liberate ourselves from those systems and institutions is an act of both decolonization and abolition. It's also a step toward anti-racism. So Ibrahim Kendi talks about, he is so eloquent on this issue of anti-racism, you can't just be racist, right? Or anti-racist, you have to also take action, right? It's not okay just to say I'm not a racist. It means that we now have to engage in the work of dismantling racism at the interpersonal when safe, and at the structural and institutional levels when we can, right? When we have that voice, and creating space for people who we serve and communities who we serve to have that voice. So it's a little bit about decolonization, and then I'm going to keep moving along. And, so what does this look like in behavioral health? So first and foremost, the literature out there is telling us that we need to start with an understanding first of how ethno-racial and oppression-based traumas and other forms of cumulative and collective trauma impact behavioral health outcomes. So and so not only do we need to acknowledge and own and see that, we need to analyze our own practices and our own systems to make sure we're not perpetuating that. And then we need to be skillful and mindful in ways that we can address that in our work. It also means that we radically acknowledge this work is about getting in good trouble, right? This work is to approach decolonization means we shake up systems, or abolition or anti-racism. So it's radically acknowledging the entrenched historical and present day relationships of our professions and carceral institutions, as I mentioned. It's also about dismantling systems and institutions that support racism and other oppression, honoring and making space for the multiple ways we know things, our lived expertise, right? The ways in which we define our pain and the ways in which we know we can heal. Also knowing what hasn't worked, right? Really listening and hearing people when they're striving toward healing, what hasn't worked for them, what has created barriers, or what has really dismantled their healing process. So creating that space for deep traditional wisdom and healing practices from Black, Indigenous, and people in communities of color. It's also about the creation of culturally affirming and meaningful healing spaces where the people we serve are represented, right? Their identities are represented, where they feel they belong, and they have a sense of home and safety in that space, and where they know that they matter, that they count. So this is what we know in creating those spaces, walking in, that's a right away a step toward healing. And then also developing culturally relevant assessments and interventions, and again, defined for and by Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And then finally, promote collective healing. So we spend so much time, oh my God. So I'm not going to go on I might go on a slight tangent, so I apologize about this, but I have some beef with the idea of self-care and how it's being presented right now. So for social work, this has now been embedded, self-care, the concept of self-care has been embedded into our code of ethics. And I have so much like other terminology has been colonized, it's concerning the ways in which sometimes we approach self-care. So what I would like to put forward is a concept of collective care and healing, which is that we prioritize, certainly we prioritize our own well-being, but that's in context of understanding that for many of us, if others who we love and care about in our own communities are not healing and thriving, it's incredibly difficult for us to experience healing and thriving. And so the idea of collective care is that we attend to our needs, as well as understanding we have a responsibility to one another in our own well-being. So I shared an article, it's called The Heretical Truth. It's just a brief article that I wrote, just a little bit on the idea of self-care versus collective care. And I'll hit this a little bit later too, but I'm not sure if Andrea will be sharing it in chat or however, but it's there for you if you all are curious about where I'm going with this. So, okay, I forgot to say this, I always forget. So this PowerPoint is for you all as like a thing that you can have and that you can look back on, right? It's like a toolkit. So I know already, I apologize because the the type is small, there's too many words, I already know. So I apologize, because this is just really meant for you all to have as a resource, to really, be able to understand now, okay, now we're moving into these ideas and spaces of how do we start this decolonization process? How do we embed anti-racism? How do we embed decolonization in our own practices? And one of the very first things we do is we need to shift our gaze away from solely focusing on individual trauma. So I started doing trauma informed. So way back in the early 2000s, and actually the late 1990s, I started trying to figure out in New Mexico what was out there to talk about trauma, to talk about culture, and to talk about other forms of oppression like sexism and homophobia, right? What was out there, all three things together, a systems approach. So we started these conversations out in community, and know that those dialogues have been happening forever, right? Like, and so, my showing up in the early 2000s didn't make any difference, except to say these conversations have been going on forever. And so the current literature out there, first of all, we hear all kind of buzzwords about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And so if you say you have 4 to 6 adverse childhood experiences, it ramps you up in this spectrum of maybe at-risk health behaviors all the way to early passing, early death, right? So what is little discussed is that ACEs is those adverse childhood experiences are potentially traumatic, right? Potentially traumatic. And I throw that out there because I'm going to introduce a new way of thinking about trauma right now that may feel weird, but just stick with me, okay? So ACEs also never attends to ethno-racial and other forms of trauma that occur. And so this conversation is to start us thinking, when we open our eyes to trauma exposure, and I use that term versus being traumatized, trauma exposure, when we start thinking about that, we want to think more collectively and broadly, especially when serving Black, Indigenous, and people in communities of color. So what does that mean? We start off with this idea of cumulative and collective, right? So let's break down collective. So collective traumas are psychological reactions to a traumatic event that affect a populace, that affect an entire society. And what you'll notice to the right here, I've gone ahead and put some examples to help kind of figure this out. So it suggests a tragedy that is reflected and representative in the collective memory of the group. However, so that's anyone within a group setting where there's been war, genocide, pandemic, environmental disasters, those pieces. What I want to drill down to is ideas of communal trauma. So that gets us a little bit more close to what we need to be attending to as mental health providers. So that communal trauma is so powerful to me. It's the idea that a harm or a wrong committed against a targeted racialized group that is so horrendous, right? So horrendous that it induces a traumatic condition. And so I've given you examples of this as well, but these traumatic conditions exist and evolve into the collective memories of racialized harms and wrongs that are tied to our cultural identity, and also our lived experiences, and our sense of place. Place means where we feel at home. So our sense of place, and it works through in everyday consciousness. It's really important, though, the author tells us here, communal trauma is not victimhood. It's a legitimate response to harm and wrongdoing that's occurred. So it's telling us a different story about trauma. It's what's called a counter story, where we start to introduce the strength that comes from from collective trauma exposure. So also I want to share a little bit about cultural trauma. So this, again, is a term I want to make sure is not co-opted and is really specific to communities who have experienced racism and oppression. So cultural trauma occurs when members of a collective feel they've been subjugated to horrendous events that leave indelible marks on their group consciousness, marking their memories forever, right? And so I'm going to just name them, right? I'm going to name mass shootings, police use of lethal force, border closings, mass deportation of the families, and separation. One of the things that has been profoundly impactful for those who I serve is deportation or ICE detention, and then the loss of life by violence in ICE detention facilities. So that's significant, right? And then systemic and structural racism. So questions before I keep moving on. Let me check in chat real quick. Oh, thank you so much for the article. So, many of you already probably know these concepts, right? But how, so I'm just going to keep, encouraging us to think, how are we already using this in our practices? How can we do more of this? How can we start being thoughtful and mindful about these types of trauma in ways that the people we serve, that we really honor those lived experiences. Cumulative is what happens over time when we keep getting exposed to racism, racialized sexism, homophobia, when we keep getting exposed to these things over time. And then I'm going to do a time check real quick. Okay. So, man, time's flying. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay. So ethno-racial. So right about the time I put forward the term oppression-based trauma, ethno-racial trauma began to gain leg, right? And to be able, we started seeing it out there and people were starting to use it, which to me was amazing to give name and voice to experience these lived experiences, right? So ethno-racial and oppression-based trauma, I kind of see hand in hand a little bit. So ethno-racial is the individual and or collective psychological distress and fear of danger that is resultant from experiencing this part is really deep for me, and witnessing discrimination, threats of harm, violence, and intimidation directed at an ethno-racial minority group. So then oppression-based trauma, I'll just skip to that real quick, kind of builds on that a little bit, where it talks about trauma exposure and lived experiences of personally mediated. So that means, someone doing something to me that is racist or sexist or homophobic. Or institutional and structural forms of oppression through symbolic pieces. And I'll share a little bit about what that means: emotional, verbal, physical, sexual, economic, and environmental manifestations. And this occurs across our lifespans. And then historical trauma. So I always preface this too, because Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, when she introduced this to, the world, when she brought this forward as naming the lived experiences of, as she named it. So, this term historical trauma is really about the experience of Indigenous peoples in the United States and true of other Indigenous populations, over 500 years of physical, emotional, social, and spiritual genocide from European and American colonialist policy, right? When Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart schooled us on that, at the same time she was saying you cannot consider historical trauma without considering intergenerational resilience. And so she shares with us that cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over a lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma, and compounding discrimination, racism, and oppression, that is historical trauma, but it is also present day cumulative and collective trauma. And while we talk about that, particularly because it impacts Indigenous populations, we always need to be mindful of intergenerational resilience. And that's really important to the work that I want to share with you today. So I'm only going to, show a little bit more of these definitions, but they're there for you, okay, at any point in time. But we always, in this work, to me, I truly see this as something we need to begin to integrate into our intakes, into our assessments. We need to include and create safe spaces to talk about. We need to not be fearful of addressing racism and other harm, right? We cannot shy away from this. So the main thing that I wanted to share right here with you really are two concepts. One is an experience that we as providers may feel that it's important to be mindful of, right? So I mentioned that I'm mixed Latina, right? So I experience skin privilege. I also experience a lot of privilege associated with my education. So there are a lot of doors that are open for me that are not open for my community. And I also experience racism less because of my skin privilege. Racial battle fatigue is when a person shares an identity, a cultural identity with the people and communities who they are serving, and they themselves are going through it, right? They are going through the same oppression, the same racism, the same racialized sexism, those pieces. So it's race and oppression related stressors such as exposure to racism and the time and energy. Oh, I apologize. It says BIYOC there. I apologize about that. That's Black and Indigenous youth of color. So this is true of all Black, Indigenous, and people and communities of color. So the time and energy that BIPOC people spend in addressing these things, not just solely for our own selves, but also for the people we serve, right? And so, there is a fatigue that goes along with that, and it creates psychological and physiological distress. So there's a name for it, and I appreciated learning that name for it, which is racial battle fatigue. There is also something called resilience fatigue, and this one's tricky, right? Because we really like to kind of lean into resilience. And so, I might propose that radical hope and healing is a way to start perceiving this work more frequently with than resilience. And let me break that down. So resilience fatigue is real talk, and it's this idea that it's an exhaustion that comes from prolonged period of attempting to cope and manage with stress, stay motivated and stay strong and stay positive and stay on track, right? Resilience fatigue also comprises the exhaustion of resilience that is required to address chronic adversity and structural inequity that lead to historical trauma and present day trauma across generations, right? So I loved this. To me was so moving, right? So this author tells us any concept of resilience that does not contextualize the long history of racial and other inequities and ongoing structural violence becomes a challenging one. So I wanted to, to the left here is an image that really means something to me because I have family in this region. This is a poster about resilience that was in New Orleans. And it says here, stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means you're about to do something else to me. I am not resilient. So powerful, powerful words there. And I think, resonate for so many, right? So here's where I'm gonna start blowing through stuff because I want you to get that. And I'm just so sorry. We've got like a good 15, 20 minutes left. And so I'm sorry, there's a lot. And this is just such a passion area for me. I get all excited, right? So I want to, bear with me. I'll try to stay slow, and I'm definitely here for any kind of questions. And you can be like, hey, Anna, chill out, take it slower. And I'm cool with that as well. So I created a theory. And the basic thing about this theory is it's New Mexico centric. It's researched, right? And this idea is that we needed different language to address these types of trauma, while also understanding that we're getting continual exposure in these ways to types of trauma, but we are continuing to collectively heal. And our culture is a source of strength. Our identities are strength, right? So the major finding from this research literally was that participants across both studies said, yes, absolutely, I experienced racialized, ethno-racial, and other forms of collective trauma exposure, but I also am expressing my identity, my capital, and I'm healing simultaneously. So it's a new way of thinking about trauma exposure. And it's a different narrative, right? Than, you go through this, you're exposed, and then somehow you're damaged, right, for the long haul. It's a different way of perceiving healing, based on, our traditions and our roots. So a dear friend of mine, Jerry Teo, he schooled me one time. He was like, we were talking about something, and he's like, and I would never use the term bootstrapping, but I don't know, somehow bootstrapping came up, and like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and these concepts of bootstrapping. And my friend Jerry Taylor, he tells me, he's like, on it, it's like this, we pull ourselves up by our root straps, right? Our cultural roots and our traditions. And that's how we heal. It's not about bootstrapping, it's about root strapping. And so that's Jerry Taylor, and I'll never forget that, right? So skipping through this, just wanting to let you know there is information about the 2 studies that have been conducted. There is my dissertation work is published, and then the Ritus research is coming out soon. It's been in press for like, I don't know, 1,000 years. Someday it's going to come out. It's going to be really cool. There's great, it's a photo voice. So it's arts-based research, which is something I feel really committed to. So there's some powerful imagery in there. But anyways, it's coming out. And main thing I kept this slide in here as, in regard to this research, because I really wanted to highlight a couple of things. So we had good representation in both studies of the communities here in New Mexico. We also had good representation with regard to LGBT plus identity, as well as gender non-binary identity. So I feel really blessed about that, and who was able to participate. And what we found, so some of the questions I was asking were about interpersonal, structural, and institutional experiences with racism. To be clear, the participants were social work students. So there is that lens. But the participants who were Black and Indigenous shared, they had higher acuity of responses overall in these responses. And some of the things that came up was Black, Indigenous, and Latinx participants experienced people in positions of authority, assuming they would not be intelligent. Many were made to feel invisible, or what's called spotlighted, and asked to act as representative of their entire communities. So again, back to that racial battle fatigue and things that we deal with. Some participants reported generational trauma within their families and communities. And this part, and particularly for the dialogue around decolonization, this part was super moving to me. And I just wanted to uplift this as something to be aware of, that Indigenous and First Nations participants reported often or very often experiencing feeling physically ill after instances of racism, feelings of stress, anxiety, and anger and depression as a result of being exposed to statues, pictures, and other imagery that reminded them of colonization or genocide, and felt anxious about racial tensions alongside feeling hopeless that racism can change in the United States. And so let me see if there's anything else I want to say? Oh, and this is kind of an interesting finding. So there were some Anglo participants who had other minoritized identities. And so interesting, I found it like an interesting unanticipated finding, which was that peers out in community or in classrooms or other settings told white participants and LGBT plus participants that Black, Indigenous, and people of color no longer experience racism, or that they were colorblind and do not see color. And so, why I kind of highlight this is because this is happening in spaces of behavioral health, right? This is happening out in community. And so, if we kind of feel like, oh my gosh, this isn't. So back to the gentleman's comment earlier in chat, this idea of, be respectful toward people's lived expertise, because this is real. This is really happening. And so I just wanted to highlight that, that came forward in the data. So now what? Oh my gosh. So we've got like 2 seconds left in our conversation. So this is my most absolute favorite part of this conversation. So, I kind of broke down some painful, really painful things. And when we really sit quiet and we reflect and introspect about these things, this is sources of great suffering. You know, I evoke and mention my mother in this experience because she was a woman of color. My first lived experiences with racism was in my own home, from my father to my mother, you know, so we carry these legacies with us, right? So very, very deep. And you know, I would almost say, like, you know, soul felt, definitely, but we also, you know, we feel these things in our bodies, right? And I want you to, you know, be mindful of all of that, but at the same time acknowledge and understand that identity is cure, right? The identity, our sources for identity are curative in so many ways. It creates a sense of place, a sense of home, a sense of radical hope, a sense of healing. And that's what the coolest part about the research that I was able to do, is while all of my participants were showing me these various forms of racism and oppression and other cumulative types of trauma exposure, they were showing me this stuff. And this is all New Mexico specific, and it's so meaningful. So what you are looking at here is a spectrum of cultural capital. So often we do not hear about these things when we learn how to become behavioral health providers. We hear about models and evidence-based this and that, and you know, we do not hear about the real lived experience, or we talk strengths-based. We talk a game of strengths-based, right? But we never really, or I shouldn't say never, we rarely get opportunities to go deep on what sources of strength are really there from our points of identity. Even though research tells us that racial and other identity strength is protective against behavioral health needs. So research tells us that. So this is what I got to find out, and this was so cool. So in the middle, you have, so literally in 2005, I read this article by a Latinx a scholar, and her name is Tara Yoso. She literally changed my life in this article called "Whose Culture Has Capital." And what she introduced in that article was that, you know, we deal with all these cultural deficit narratives, right? All these ideas of how our communities are broken. Like, again, think back to historical trauma. And in its truest intent, when Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart talked about that, she told us always know intergenerational resilience is happening at the same time. But what if folks latch onto historical trauma, right? Which sometimes has negative connotations. So Tara Yoso says, let's change the story. Let's talk about what we know out in communities of color. So this idea of whose culture has capital, she introduces these 6 forms of cultural capital in the middle here. So she talks about aspirational capital, and I'm going to make this make sense in behavioral health setting. So aspirational capital is our ability to maintain our hopes and dreams even in the face of adversity. And that means, you know, our hopes and dreams of living a healed life, of, you know, if you choose to use the term sobriety, of living a sober life, right? Aspirational capital allows us to maintain that dream, you know, in the face of any kind of adversity. Linguistic capital is the way in which we know and problem solve based on speaking more than one language. And the ways our brains are patterned in being bi or multilingual is so powerful, because it actually it transforms and makes more creative the problem solving process. How this makes sense too is that when we provide linguistically relevant services in behavioral health, we are allowing and we are creating that safe space for people to speak their first language. And that language is the seat of emotion and healing, right? So linguistic capital is so powerful. Much of our traditions, our dichos, our stories, our things that come through are coming through in our first language and are difficult to translate into a second language. So linguistic capital is powerful. Familial capital is not just your auntie or uncle who can, like, hook you up with stuff, although that's helpful, right? That's all very helpful. Linguistic familial capital is actually how we transmit culture across time, how we transmit our knowledge, our healing ways, our morals, our values, our spirituality through familial capital. So we learn through family in relationship. And how this relates to behavioral health is one of the most primary things that we can do, one of the most evidence-based practices that we have to serve Black, Indigenous, and people in communities of color is to be real and to prioritize relationship, prioritize building trust, right? So familial capital, social capital, I'm not going to go too much into. Navigational capital is another one I love. And especially, I forgot to mention that my behavioral health expertise is in serving adolescents. So my whole clinical career has been serving young people and their families, right? And I've only ever done that out in community. I've never had an office. I've always done therapy out in community. So navigational capital and resistant capital really makes sense for me with youth, right? So navigational capital is the ability to move through systems and institutions successfully that were not designed for or by communities of color, right? Navigational capital is your ability to show up at a behavioral health provider's doorstep and say, you know what, I'm here and I want to heal. And being able to navigate that when that isn't necessarily the space that that was designed for you to step in, right? And finally, resistant capital from Tara Yosa's perspective, probably my favorite, I think, overall. Resistant capital is the ability to stand up and speak your truth to power in ways that don't get you locked up or you know, whatever. Being able to speak your truth to power, and you have an innate understanding of what is just and what is right and what is equitable. So these pieces, you know, as I'm sharing these, I want you to kind of evoke people who you're serving and see where some of these points of cultural capital actually, you can see them if you're looking, if you're open to actually hearing it. So that's, you know, 6 different types right there. All the participants were hitting those types, right? But what was also unique to the participants here in New Mexico is spiritual capital, faith-based pieces. Ethnic consciousness wealth is the idea that being within community, within the people who share your own ethnic identity, that creates a sense of ethnic pride, which is also healing and curative, right? And then perseverant wealth, I'm going to talk a little bit about. So I'm not down for grit. I'm not down for that concept of grit. That also has been really colonized and westernized, and it creates a kind of backhanded sort of experience of like, you know, if someone's not able to show that resilience or that grit, somehow they're deficient. And so perseverant wealth is similar to aspirational capital, and it's the idea that it's not about grit, it's about endurance, it's about enduring through immense adversity toward hope and healing, right? That's what perseverant wealth is. And then I want to get to the left side here, which talks about native capital. So in all of our conversations out there was not robust literature around Indigenous populations and cultural capital in ways that we see some of this other stuff more frequently. So I wanted to highlight in New Mexico, among the participants who identified as Indigenous First Nations in these 2 studies, overwhelmingly demonstrated native capital that is specific to Indigenous communities and the idea of nation building. So healing, you know, pursuing education and going back to community and sharing what was learned in order to build nations is so critical. And then finally, the sense of intergenerational resilience or native resiliency. The last one I want to kind of leave on is ganas, the idea. So I mentioned grit because ganas often gets compared to grit. And ganas is not grit. Ganas is doing the work in order for the generations behind you to have a better life, right? You're doing this work to honor your ancestors, to honor your parent or caregiver sacrifices. You're doing this to create pathways for the people within your family and community to be able to thrive in the future. So ganas is important, and it's really about I will fight this fight, whether it's toward healing or toward hope or toward attaining a goal, whatever it is. I'll fight this fight because I want things to be better for the people and community who I love. So that is time. Basically, we're at time. So I want to orient you. And I'm so sorry, this was so much information. I want to orient you to just a few things in here that you can utilize as tools. So cultural humility has been around since the 1990s, and it was created by two women of color in public health. And it is such a powerful modality that transcends anti-racism, decolonization, and abolition. So these are some core powerful things that we need to build within our practices if they don't already occur for you all. But the idea of lifelong learning and critical self-reflection, recognizing and challenging power imbalances, and holding systems and institutions, including behavioral health systems, accountable. So I give you here a spectrum of what that might look like to apply. So one of the biggest criticisms of cultural humility is that there's like no how to, right? There's no step by step. So I wanted to kind of give you like a how to of how you might go through this cycle of culturally humble practices. And then I wanted to give you, so one of the first tenets of that is critical reflection, critical self-reflectivity. And so I wanted to pose for you questions that you could be asking yourself, or that you could do within your team, within your behavioral health practice, asking questions like, how are we acknowledging the cultural trauma that marginalized communities have experienced or are experiencing? How do we create safe spaces for people we serve to share about their culture's history and lived experiences with racism? And simultaneously, how do we do our own work, right? How do we learn what we need to learn without depending on the Black, Indigenous, and communities who we serve? How do I actively work to give more power to the cultural group, to the people we serve whose cultural group has had power taken from them? So really great, thought-provoking, critically reflective questions. These can be used in supervision. You can use them, with your own selves, however you would like. And then intent versus impact. So, earlier one of the community agreements was about understand the impact, right? And assume positive intent. So this tool was transformative for me. It was my first tool that I learned in how to speak up and to have that resistant capital and speak truth when people were treating me in a racist or a sexist way, right? And so the intent versus impact statement has really given me like some good game in terms of being able to confront stuff in ways that I have never been able to before. So it changes our thinking from like, when you do this, I feel kind of thing, to this particular statement. So people don't wake up intending to be racist mostly, right? People don't necessarily wake up intending to be racist. Throughout the day, they may, however, be racist and behave in racist ways. And so people, when safe, it's okay to assume positive intent, but also to acknowledge that positive intent is not enough, right? It's not enough just to have a positive intention. So instead, we're going to explain the impact that behavior has had on us. So the statement itself is this: I recognize that your intention was not to be hurtful, harmful, racist, oppressive, whatever your word is. However, when you did this, when you asked me to take notes, right, and I'm leading the meeting, or when you gave me 5 clients who were Spanish speaking when you already know my load is high, right, or the list goes on and on and on, right? The impact it has had on me is this, and in the future, I would like for you to X, Y, and Z. And it stops that whole, well, I didn't mean it. It was just a joke. you're taking this the wrong way. Don't be so emotional. All the crazy stuff that we hear in response to that, it stops that, because literally you're saying, I don't care. I recognize that your intention probably wasn't this. However, this is the impact it had on me. And that has been a powerful tool that I've used throughout this work. I will end here with commit to restivism. So in our trauma dialogues, a lot of times we hear about the responses to fight, flight, or freeze as responses to trauma. What's often not addressed is our response to rest and stop and sleep. And so, you know, that is an autonomic response to a traumatic event or to trauma exposure. So I wanted to throw that out there, that there is a whole movement in social activism right now about taking true radical good care of yourself, like really taking rest when you need it, understanding, you know, what is our threshold for this work. And when you're well resourced, do the work. When you need resourcing, rest and refuel. This is also where the importance of collective healing comes into play, and collective care. And so I noticed that article was put into chat. And I'm just going to throw this out here. These are some of the things that I've utilized around radical self-care and collective care, practicing creativity. You know, my research is arts-based, and that's a blessing for me. Staying connected, not just connected to people, but connected to community, connected to the land, connected to your identity and your spirituality. Engaging in celebration of the wins, right? There aren't very many in life sometimes, so celebrate those wins and engage in ceremony, whatever that means for you. And so with that, that's all I have for you today. So I'm just truly honored to be here with you all, and am here for maybe 1 to 2 more minutes. Oh, Pamela, hi. Thank you so much for being here. It's really nice to see you as well. So I'm here for any kind of questions you might have, or feedback, and I'm only able to stay for about 2 more minutes. Oh my gosh, at the very end of the PowerPoint, there is my contact information. And there's also the resources. You know, there's a great one called For Indigenous Eyes Only that talks about decolonization, and also some decolonization social work books, and then a really bomb article that I included in there as well, specific to Asian American behavioral health and decolonization. So yeah, oh, thank you so much, Eric. Thank you all for being here. Any thoughts or questions before I step away?
This is Tone. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm getting a lot of messages that we have to have you come back and do a longer presentation, or, you know, more in depth. And so I truly want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart, because I feel like you brought to the table so many things that we tend to put aside. And see, I'm trying not to get emotional. You're gonna make me cry. But I see the value in the work and the need for us to pay attention to these things. And so I'm glad we're having you present to us. And I would love to invite you back to talk to several of our groups here, because we also have other different projects that are going on with a youth focus. And so I was just like, you mentioned working with youth. I'm like, see, I was like, yeah. So there's so much more. I just thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's such a true honor to be here in this space with you and everyone. And I feel so grateful, and thank you for that amazing feedback. So thank you. And yes, I'm down for more conversation.